Hello, everyone, from the McLaughlin family bunker in the heartland of America, Center City, Philadelphia, USA. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I am a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania, and I hope you and yours are staying safe, physically distant, and sane. We're holding it together for the most part, but it's certainly still quite strange. And it's strange enough, even my 1-year-old daughter can definitely tell something's up. And by the way, you might hear the girls in the background playing a little bit. So it's always been the case during this pandemic. You might hear some extra voices. Last week we talked a bit about some studies that were performed to try and get a bit more granular about just how far this novel coronavirus travels when someone coughs or sneezes. And the main takeaway was that it may be able to travel quite a bit farther than we widely appreciate. I suggest you check out last Sunday's video to see some of the findings from those studies and some pretty cool images and videos. I also reviewed some of the case reports of patients who present with neurological symptoms when they go to the hospital who end up testing positive for COVID-19. You can go check that if you're interested. There haven't been really any significant developments in our understanding of how COVID-19 might affect the brain, but we're all keeping our eyes peeled. So before we get into the article that I found interesting for this week, I caught a study that was published in Emerging Infectious Diseases, which is basically a peer-reviewed journal that's published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC. And so the journal's open access, which means that you don't have to have a super expensive subscription or anything to read it. So you can go check this paper out if you want to see it for yourself. My daughter already has. So the study that I'm talking about right now, it was pretty simple. So it was a group in Wuhan, China, the part of the world from which we're pretty sure this novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19 emerged. And they basically scanned different parts of a hospital in the city of Wuhan to see if and where surfaces in the hospital were contaminated with viral particles. So, they literally collected swab samples from various surfaces and objects in either the sort of general ward for people who are infected with COVID-19, as well as the intensive care unit, or the ICU. And that's what the novel coronavirus kind of looks like. I think the top one's actually pretty cool. So the pink, small little pink particles are SARS-CoV-2 particles, viral particles. So in other words, they evaluated two main parts of the hospital. One part where people were being treated for COVID-19 but hadn't really developed super severe symptoms, and then another part of the hospital where people were experiencing very severe symptoms, where they're monitored, the ICU. And so the ICU had 15 patients, while the general ward had 24 patients. And so they also tested the air for aerosolized viral particles, which basically just means that they were testing to see if some of the viral particles were just sort of floating around in the air and not just falling directly to the ground after somebody coughed or sneezed. And so, unsurprisingly, the surfaces with which clinicians often interacted were among the most contaminated. And the highest concentration surfaces were computer mice, trash cans, sickbed handrails, so the sort of rails that they put on either side of the hospital beds, and doorknobs. So the sleeve cuffs of medical staff also produced some positive results. Obviously, the primary concern for this study was SARS-CoV-2, right? But I have to assume that most respiratory pathogens would likely follow a somewhat similar trajectory. So I guess my point is probably best to avoid just randomly touching the computer mice in hospitals. Not that it's probably a particularly critical concern for you. While it's fairly interesting to non-clinicians, those findings obviously have greater relevance for clinicians who are, on the front line of treating COVID-19. And so, I'm sure it's not particularly surprising that surfaces like computer mice and trash cans tended to be very contaminated with SARS-CoV-2. But perhaps the more concerning finding came from their sampling of airflow near air outlets. And so they detected virus near the air outlets of patients' rooms and doctors' offices. So this suggests that the virus can travel through the air, but mostly in areas proximal to patients. And the closer to patients, the greater the concentration in the air. And so overall, they argue that the virus was detectable in both the ICU and the general ward. But importantly, they found that it was distributed in high air and high traffic surfaces. I'm sorry, air in those areas of the hospital, and then high traffic surfaces, so things that a lot of people were touching a lot of clinicians were touching. And so they found that there was also a higher concentration in the ICU than in the general ward. And so their findings essentially corroborate the kind of air trajectories described in that MIT study that I discussed last week, that the virus might be able to travel somewhere around 4 meters, so like around 13 feet or so. And so it's probably worth repeating that these were tests that were conducted in a hospital with a high concentration of people who were, for sure, infected with the virus that causes COVID-19, right? Also, airflow in these kinds of hospital rooms is specifically engineered to follow a specific trajectory, one input of air and one output of air. So, generally speaking, most rooms outside of hospitals aren't really necessarily designed to have like so specific an airflow pattern. But at a minimum, the study emphasizes the need for personal protective equipment, or PPE, among clinicians treating COVID-19 patients. But it's also worth keeping in mind that there's a good reason that a lot of organizations have finally gotten on the same page and recommending that people start wearing face masks when going out in public. All right, so the next story, the University of Queensland compiled a nice list of potential drug candidates to treat COVID-19, or really they focus on the strategy that's being used to develop new potential drug candidates. And so what makes this list interesting, though, is that these are drugs that have already gone through clinical trials for other conditions. Why is that important? Because at least in the United States, before a drug can be used to treat any condition, it has to go through a series of clinical trials to ensure that a drug is, 1, safe, meaning it doesn't induce its own damage when it gets into the body, 2, to ensure that it's effective to treat the condition for which it's being tested. Ideally, these are usually blinded to compare the candidate drug to a different treatment to get a sense of just how effective it is relative to other treatments or a placebo. And then after those first two, there are other bigger phases of clinical trials to expand the sample of people who are able to use a medication if it's past those first two hurdles. So if a drug's already made it through those clinical trials, we can be quite a bit more confident that it's not going to cause severe harm in most people. And that speeds up the availability of a treatment by several years. And so this group is using a method called high throughput screening, which is just basically a way to test huge numbers of compounds to see if they might be effective in treating any given medical condition. And so it's a combination of a bunch of different technologies, really, to enable scientists to more quickly find an effective treatment than they could just on their own without those technologies. And so it's sort of like throwing spaghetti at a wall. And you're going to have to work with me here, but imagine that your goal is to find the kind of pasta that sticks to a wall for the longest period of time. So picture having like 40 bowls of different kinds of pasta in front of you. Well, you could spend your time tossing those bowls of pasta against the wall to figure out which little strands of pasta are the stickiest. High throughput screening is basically like having a computer system use a bunch of models to predict not only which kinds of pasta will be the stickiest, but which specific pieces of those pastas will be the stickiest. So instead of having to throw all 40 bowls of spaghetti at the wall or pasta at the wall, you just throw the 15 little pieces of pasta against the wall to see which among those already sticky pieces are the stickiest. So I know it's like not the best simile I've ever come up with, but the point is that it speeds up the early exploration of these candidate drugs considerably. So, instead of like looking for a needle in a haystack, it's like you have a robot that removes all those pieces of hay that don't even remotely resemble needles. All right, I'll stop with the similes at the point. I'm sure you get it. So the group that's doing this high throughput screening identified a specific enzyme, which is basically like a little tool within biological systems that enables biochemical reactions to occur. And this particular enzyme may be required for the virus to replicate itself when it infects cells. And so you are probably somewhat intuitively familiar with enzymes. So like neurons in the brain that create neurotransmitters like serotonin or dopamine, they need to have specific enzymes present for them to be able to make those neurotransmitters. Without those enzymes, they're completely unable to make those neurotransmitters. So like without tryptophan hydroxylase or tyrosine hydroxylase, neurons can't make serotonin or dopamine. So similarly, viruses need specific enzymes to replicate themselves and then spread through the body. So this team might have identified a handful of compounds that can interfere with an enzyme that the novel coronavirus requires to replicate. And so, to be clear, like this would mean that we would have an arrow in our biomedical quiver to treat COVID-19 that isn't a vaccine, which is going to take many, many months before a vaccine is available. So that's pretty exciting. Like that would be a huge step forward in combating this disease, this virus. All right. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about is sort of related. You might have heard a lot about drugs called chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine. And, if you've been paying attention to the discussion of potential treatments for COVID-19, you've probably heard about this. The President of the United States has highlighted it, or it in combination with something else several times as a potential treatment, and really as a source of optimism. Though, several medical experts within the federal government aren't quite as sanguine. And so before I go too deep into this discussion, Dr. Nicole Aiello, a PhD in cellular molecular biology from Penn, where I got my PhD, who's now a postdoc at Princeton University, she's written a few articles related to COVID-19 that I think are really clear and detailed, and I'd recommend you go check them out. They're on Medium, and I'm sure that she's also on Twitter, so Dr. Nicole Aiello. So chloroquine is essentially a chemical cousin of quinine, which you've probably ingested anytime you've had a gin and tonic. And it's been used for many, many decades now to treat malaria. Hydroxychloroquine is also a chemical cousin of quinine, though it's reported to have fewer side effects or less severe side effects than chloroquine. So hydroxychloroquine, like chloroquine, is used to prevent malaria. And so in addition to preventing malaria, hydroxychloroquine is also used to treat conditions like lupus or arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, due to its putative immunosuppressant effects. So, those are pretty distinct conditions, right? But they both involve a person's own immune system attacking various parts of their own bodies. So, inhibiting the immune system can inhibit the severity of that attack. So Dr. Aiello, Nicole Aiello, discusses several potential mechanisms that might explain how it might be that hydroxychloroquine might be beneficial for the treatment of COVID-19. But for our purposes, I think these details aren't particularly useful. But it's worth noting that there are multiple potential mechanisms, and it's not entirely clear which mechanism, if any, might be involved in a therapeutic effect. So Dr. Aiello also discusses some of the clinical trials that are either recently completed, or are currently underway to assess whether this drug even ought to be considered a frontline treatment for COVID-19. So one is a trial that was conducted in China to evaluate if hydroxychloroquine reduces the concentrations of the novel coronavirus in samples of people's throat mucosa. So just essentially like numbers of viral particles. And so if they found that people who are treated with hydroxychloroquine tend to have lower levels of the coronavirus than those who are not treated with the drug, it suggests that the drug might effectively reduce the virus's ability to replicate. So regardless even of the severity of their symptoms or whatever, that would suggest that this is a beneficial thing to have. But that's all that they were measuring, right? Concentration of viral particles. So they split 30 patients into two groups, half of whom received hydroxychloroquine and half who did not. And so ultimately they found no significant difference following treatment with the drug. But as Dr. Aiello highlights, there are some issues with the study design that make it less than ideal. So it could be that the time points at which they sampled the viral particles in people's throats just weren't optimal to detect an effect of the drug. So, but regardless, it's not a particularly compelling result. And so in France, a trial was conducted in Marseille and other medicals in the south of France. And so once again, the trial had two main groups, one receiving hydroxychloroquine and a group who did not. But both, it's important to recognize that both groups received general treatment for the infection that anybody would receive, regardless of hydroxychloroquine. So contrary to the last trial, the group found a substantial proportion of the hydroxychloroquine group exhibited lower levels of the virus compared to the group who didn't. But it turned out that patients who received both hydroxychloroquine and the antibiotic azithromycin a far higher proportion of patients exhibited the absence of the virus after several days. And so this is like the major reason that you've heard this combination of hydroxychloroquine and an antibiotic being potentially ideal for the treatment of this infection. And frankly, when I first heard about this, I mean, not that I'm an immunobiologist or certainly not a clinician, I'm a neuroscientist, but you know, we all study sort of the actions of things like antibiotics, and it's sort of like, what even was the inspiration to use azithromycin to treat a viral infection? But regardless, they had these results. So, you know, compelling, right? But, and once again, I recommend you check out Dr. Aiello's Medium post because she does a great job scrutinizing this particular trial. But most notably, she notes that this study wasn't blinded. So both the clinicians and the patients knew what they were getting. So like double unblinded. And so, you know, potentially not a big deal, but, you know, we know that when neither group is blinded, this can influence clinical outcomes. So, she also notes, and I think this is a great thing to identify, that there are multiple medical centers involved in the treatment groups. Most importantly, the group of patients who received the hydroxychloroquine and then the group of patients who didn't were treated at separate medical centers. So, you know, treatments, you know, in an ideal world, treatments would ideally be largely identical. But, you know, different medical centers have different protocols, everything from like how regularly a patient is evaluated to how stringently personal protective equipment is evaluated, all of which can influence health outcomes. And then also certain COVID-19 positive patients were prevented from participating in the hydroxychloroquine treatment due to various like pre-existing health conditions, like issues with their cardiovascular system, while they were not excluded from the group that didn't receive the drug, right? So you know, it could be the case that patients who had those cardiovascular conditions may have been more vulnerable to the virus to begin with. And it just turned out that the patients included in the hydroxychloroquine group were quite a bit more likely to improve more rapidly regardless of treatment with the drug. It's like you're selecting for healthy people to test for an effect of hydroxychloroquine. And so, you know, there are a few other issues that she highlights, but perhaps the most important is that, you know, we aren't entirely sure how many patients who didn't receive the hydroxychloroquine ended up receiving azithromycin, the antibiotic. You know, did almost none of them receive the antibiotic, and might have they recovered more rapidly if they did receive azithromycin, or did most of them receive it but progressed worse despite the antibiotic treatment, right? This is an unanswered question. It's a pretty important question given that we're interested in a combination of these drugs. And so the last thing that I think is worth bringing up is that the only metric that was used, to measure how much, how patients were progressing was how much virus was still present in the patients after just under a week, not how severely sick they were, right? Like we talked about before. So it's possible that a patient, after being sick for about a week, experiences severe immune reactions to the infection with this novel coronavirus that ends up getting, you know, that immune reaction can end up severely damaging their respiratory system, causing them to remain severely debilitated, despite the fact that on their measure, they might look as though they've improved. So Dr. Aiello also notes that this trial was very, very rapidly peer-reviewed. It was technically peer-reviewed, but extraordinarily rapidly. And one of the authors of the paper is the editor-in-chief of the journal in which it was published. So, you know, this isn't necessarily evidence of poor science, right? There's nothing wrong with that, you know, assuming that every publication goes through, you know, a substantial or sufficient peer review. But, you know, it's certainly a concern, particularly given the number of people that might be treated according to their findings, right? We're talking about, you know, millions of people potentially. And so, you know, in science, we do our best to apply as much objectivity as we possibly can. And this is, you know, just a potential source of its absence. Okay, so another trial was conducted in France, in Paris this time, and the findings were considerably less compelling than the one that was headed up by a group in Marseille. And it suggests that there was no identifiable improvement in patient recovery following treatment with hydroxychloroquine. All right, so finally, a trial was conducted in Wuhan, again, you know, the likely origin of the outbreak of COVID-19 in China, which had better controls than the study that was conducted in Marseille, and measured a broader set of health-related indicators like temperature and severity of pneumonia, stuff like that. And so to make a long story short, it seemed that hydroxychloroquine marginally expedited patient recovery, but certainly did not result in a substantial improvement, suggesting that, everyone diagnosed with COVID-19 ought to receive the drug, right? That's just not what their findings would support. And so there are a bunch of currently ongoing clinical trials to evaluate the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine in countries all over the world. So that's great. In Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Thailand, and in the United States. And in the United States, there are 2 trials, one at the University of Minnesota and one at Washington University in St. Louis. So, all this to say that, while there are some reasons to be hopeful that hydroxychloroquine may represent a tool to treat COVID-19 patients, there's certainly no reason to suspect that it's going to be a panacea for coronavirus infections. There's no reason to be that confident about that drug. Also, the drug has pretty substantial side effects. Even when administered by a clinician, it's not like a drug that you wouldn't notice that you were taking. You'll feel it. But perhaps more alarming is the prospect of people just trying to get it on their own and taking it without any clinical supervision. Without any knowledge of dose, the potential downsides are so much greater than the downsides of just physical distancing. And, I think there ought to be clear communications from the federal government that this is still a completely experimental treatment and that folks shouldn't feel confident enough in its efficacy to put their well-being at risk based on an assumption that it's going to prevent them from developing COVID-19. Again, there are pretty substantial side effects of the treatment with this drug. Again, even administered by clinicians, but particularly if people are just trying to take it on their own. And so, at the moment, for me, it strikes me as rather premature to be overly hopeful that hydroxychloroquine represents an effective treatment for COVID-19, particularly in vulnerable demographics. But it might be useful to treat the disease. But, to be perfectly sincere, I'm more hopeful that a novel antiviral treatment may be identified in the coming months. Particularly, so the one of the reasons that I'm hopeful for that is that if a group can identify a small molecule therapeutic, right, a drug that targets some biological pathway upon which the virus relies to replicate, it could be produced very rapidly and made available worldwide. And that would be a real game changer. Okay, that's what I have for you today. Let's start the hot life. Oh, we have some comments. So in the end, don't take medical advice from politicians. Right, yeah, that's right, Hal. Good to see you, Joy. Good to see you, Hal. Thanks for coming. Yeah, okay. Let's start the life. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. Happy Easter. Always do that. If you do indeed celebrate Easter. And where is the thing? There it is. That's how I say there it is to my daughter, and so now I'm just saying it to adults. There it is. Okay, so I have a YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/anthropoid, or you can just search anthropoid brain Ian or something just anthropoid Ian, anthropoid brain. And just now, I talked about, in the past 20 minutes, I talked about the potential, a couple of things. First, I talked about a study that characterized just how widely spread in a hospital the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, can be. This was a study done in Wuhan, and there's some pretty, meaningful warnings. The short story is don't touch computer mice in a hospital. I don't know why you're doing it anyways, but particularly now, don't touch computer mice. I also talked about an article that scrutinizes just how effective, how confident we ought to be in the possibility of hydroxychloroquine and or azithromycin in treating COVID-19. It was an article written by a PhD who got her PhD at Penn, cell and molecular biology, named Dr. Nicole Aiello. Recommend you check it out. She does a great job, and it's very clear. I think it would be clear to people without a background in science. And then I talked about an effort going on using high throughput screening, which is a way to rapidly identify potential drugs, to identify potential treatments for COVID-19 that have already gone through clinical trials. So that would put us way ahead of the game, and hopefully they find something, because then it could hit, it could be in your physician's hands within just a few months rather than over a year. Hello, Vikash. Ugh. God. Irritating. How are you guys doing? All right. Hi again. Hey, Beth. Beth Hoover Fitness. Huh. Yeah. My wife and I have been pursuing some fitness routines in our tiny apartment, and it's pretty funny. Hey, from Ottawa. I lived in Ottawa for several months. And then I lived in Gatineau. Very pretty, very beautiful part of the world. Happy Easter, everybody. Happy Easter, Chelsea. ADHD. Any orchids to your right? Yes, indeed, there are. In fact, she just dropped her flowers. But yeah, I've had this orchid for like over 6 years, maybe. And it has bloomed every winter. Very cool. Very impressive little plant. And I've been needing to repot it for probably about 4 years, and I still haven't. But it's doing great. She's a happy orchid, so I don't want to mess with it too much. Hello from San Antonio. I almost lived in San Antonio. I did live in Houston, but I almost worked for a company between college and grad school that was in San Antonio. I had some of the best steak I've ever had in San Antonio. Highly recommend it. But yeah, the orchids are part of a garden that's been dominated by succulents lately. I know you told me, were you going to Ottawa or U of Carleton? University of Ottawa. I was like working in a lab. It was a pretty interesting project, actually. I was working in a lab where basically, have you ever heard of a jolly jumper? I don't know. I know some people are very familiar with it. Some people have no idea. It's one of those things where you like suspend a baby basically in like a harness, and then the baby can bounce. And so this, was many years ago, and they were using the same camera systems that was used to film The Matrix, the famous bullet scene. And so basically the task was to try and understand what it was that infants were doing in these jolly jumpers. And we found different categories of infants, some that would like figure out the goal of the jolly jumper, which is to like jump at a certain frequency to like, get the highest potential bounce for your effort. And then some that never figured it out. And we could find like certain developmental click points that the infant would have to pass to then move on. So yeah, it's pretty cool. We developed like an artificial baby, a computer baby that would go through trials, would like apply a certain logic to learn how to use the jolly jumper. Kind of weird, right? Okay. Big med school. Yeah, it was awesome. They have great gyms there. Quick question. What has been your most difficult project as a brain scientist? My dissertation project. And after we're getting a call. So after this call, I will tell you all about it. Yeah. Oh, no, we lost connection. All right. Well, so here's the reason that project was so difficult. I basically, like, when I started graduate school, my goal was to be as ambitious as possible, to pick a project that would like yield such great results, because like you'd have to be crazy to try it. And weird. It seems like we're not able to connect. But and I think that's good. That's like a reasonable thing to try and do when you're starting grad school. But the problem was that I didn't really know how difficult, like I didn't understand how difficult it was going to be, and I didn't have anybody around me to instruct the methods that I ended up using, optogenetics, chemogenetics, and so as a result, I basically had to like teach myself, which is a great, it's a great way to make a scientist, but it takes a much longer, time for you to work out the kinks and make mistakes and move forward, optimize is what we call it. And so it was a very long lasting project, but I just saw that today I have I think just under 75 citations for my peer reviewed articles. I know probably for some people that's not particularly exciting, or maybe not even a big number, but for me it is. Citations meaning like other scientists referencing my publications in their publications. What does brain scientist mean? That's a great question. So I think most people, when they think, so in the United States and in much of the world, we call brain scientists neuroscientists. And I think outside of the discipline, most people, in my experience, most people have never even met a scientist. And their closest contact with science was maybe in high school. And so I think most people, they encounter biomedical science and they encounter neuroscience through the medical system. And so I think most people think that neuroscientists are the same as neurologists or neurosurgeons. And there are actually three different kinds of training. So a neurologist is a physician who has an MD or gets a medical, a graduate degree, and they will try and diagnose problems with, generally speaking, with your brain, but it could be the broader nervous system. And so, for example, if you have strange pain in your, you have strange headaches, or you're experiencing weird changes to your consciousness or just unusual changes, you go to a neurologist, and then they might deploy something like an MRI or a PET scan or a CAT scan or something. So that's a neurologist. Neurosurgeon is also a medical doctor, but they're trained to physically intervene, perform surgery. And so those are two different disciplines. Obviously they're more similar to each other, however, than the third discipline, which is my discipline, which is actually science, neuroscience. And science and medicine, while, fairly recently, medicine has evolved to be based on evidence derived from science, it wasn't always the case. And so, the training to become a scientist is unique. It all revolves around using the scientific method to ask and try and answer questions. But it's more complicated than that, and you learn about a broader array of information that is at earlier stages of discovery than a physician would, and that for good reason. You can only learn so much. The brain is a very complicated place, and a physician is primarily concerned with improving your quality of life, reducing suffering. And so, these are just different disciplines. So, but what I do is I use the scientific method to ask questions about consciousness and try and answer them. All right. Do you think COVID-19 could be cured or prevented dealing with anything with the brain? So Head Game Pro. Probably not. And so here's why. COVID-19 is caused by a coronavirus. I'm sure you've by now must have heard about all of this basic stuff. It's a coronavirus, and so as a result, like other coronaviruses, it's principally a respiratory virus. There's some really interesting features of the biology of this virus that might render it a little bit more complicated than other coronaviruses, meaning that it might be able to gain entry to cells outside of the respiratory system over time. But broadly speaking, we're talking about a virus that targets cells in your respiratory system. And that's where it does most of its business. And when people are doing badly, when they're suffering from severe symptoms of COVID-19, generally speaking, it's because their lungs are becoming so damaged that it's becoming very difficult for them to literally absorb oxygen from the air. And that's why there's such interest in ensuring we have enough ventilators. Ventilators are machines that essentially do your breathing for you. It's sort of like substituting for a diaphragm and so on to compensate for your reduced ability to absorb oxygen. However, last week on YouTube, so youtube.com/anthropoid, I talked about some of the case reports that have been coming out from multiple countries around the world of patients that first come to the hospital with neurological symptoms. And it ranges from confusion, stroke, but probably the most intriguing is confusion, where there's reports of like patients that can't tell their physicians even their own names, and they get less and less responsive over time. But what's interesting about this group is that those are the symptoms they present with, not respiratory symptoms. And they test positive for COVID-19. So that is kind of surprising. Now, this is a very, very small minority. And I should also say they do end up developing the more classic respiratory symptoms of COVID-19. But, this kind of pattern has been observed in more than just one hospital, more than just one country, everywhere from China, Italy, France, and the United States. In fact, a hospital in Italy devoted an entire unit in the hospital to specifically treating COVID-19 patients that are exhibiting neurological symptoms. So, there are a lot of potential explanations for this. And if I go deeper into this topic on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, last Sunday. But, one potential explanation is that, as I was saying, the main, the business end of COVID-19 is damage to the lungs, reducing your ability to absorb oxygen. The brain is extraordinarily oxygen demanding. It's very metabolically active. And so if you deprive the brain of oxygen for a long enough period of time, neurons will begin to die. They'll certainly function suboptimally. And so it could just be the case that like these folks, they already had some sort of underlying condition and they fall beneath the threshold, and then they start exhibiting neurological symptoms. Or it could be that there's something unique. There's a reason that this SARS-CoV-2, coronavirus 2, is not the same as SARS. It's not the same as the coronavirus that caused SARS. And so it could be the case that, some of these subtle differences might result in the virus's ability to, for example, piggyback on red blood cells and then gain entry to the brain somehow. These are questions that are not answered. Oh, and then one final thing that's worth acknowledging is that in China, scientists have identified the presence of coronaviruses outside of the lungs. And so, these are interesting questions that are not answered yet. But to answer your initial question, no, I think, the principal target that I've seen for most novel treatments, antiviral treatments for coronavirus, COVID-19, is targeting going way more upstream than the brain, right? Targeting the virus's capability of interacting with cells to gain entry in the first place. So that's my daughter in the background, by the way. Are you very confident in today's science, or am I true that science of today is alchemy of tomorrow? So Salima, I sort of understand what you mean. I think that you're basically saying, just like we look back on the science that was done in, let's say, the 18th century or 17th century, a lot of it was based on, my daughter doesn't have a lot of respect for the science of that age. But yeah, a lot of it some of it literally was alchemy. Newton practiced alchemy. Isaac Newton was also one of the most important scientists ever. And so, yeah, inevitably, as science completes, it becomes more completed, right? As science progresses, we will find that some of our assumptions of today were misunderstandings, or were based on a dearth of evidence to form a more accurate hypothesis. But the power of science, and what makes it different from alchemy, is that science fixes itself. Science autocorrects, right? Because, and here's the practical reason. As a scientist, my career incentives are to prove other scientists wrong or to discover something first, right? Those are like the way you get promoted in science is by doing that. And so, there are significant incentives to finding flaws in other people's theories or models, right? So that's not the same as alchemy, right? Alchemy is like, well, I'm not an alchemist. I won't speak for the alchemy community, but that's distinct from essentially every other discipline, right? Where you have a set of principles that, are, essentially universally applicable. But in science, those principles can change in the face of new evidence. So no. I disagree with that. I agree with part of it. I think there's a kernel of truth to that, but as a broader indictment of science, I disagree. Science of cuteness. Oh, you know what? We have actually, I have a podcast as well, Wired to be Weird. We have talked about why it is that babies are cute. Like, why do we think these babies are cute? Wired to be Weird. Oh, thank you so much for the super hearts, Joy. I really appreciate it. Oh wait, why am I doing that? Okay. And virus can morph. So sort of. So essentially all viruses can mutate. And that's because essentially every genetic system mutates. Different viruses mutate at different... So what I'm talking about there is like, a virus is just a fairly simple set of genes that essentially are all devoted to replicating itself. That's like what the genetic instructions of a virus do. It just so happens that this novel coronavirus is actually pretty big for a virus. It's like 30,000 bases. So that's pretty big relative to other viruses. And so as a result, it has a couple features that are unique to that aren't quite as common in other viruses. And one of those things is that it actually has some proofreading capability, meaning that if there's an error, there will always be errors over time. Then the little machinery that are responsible for creating new viral particles can pick it up and correct it. That's not true for a lot of viruses. But what that results in is actually a lower rate of mutation than something like, for example, the influenza virus. Okay. However, it is mutating. But it's important to keep in mind that the vast majority of the time, these mutations do not result in radically different behavior of the virus. Generally speaking, they're pretty inconsequential. But as scientists, we can follow those little mutations and we can then tell, this cluster of COVID-19 patients, they have this specific virus that has these unique little changes that occurred. And it turns out that those unique changes are most similar to this cluster in Iceland or France or whatever, and not so similar to this cluster in China. And in fact, now some studies have suggested that most of the coronavirus cases in New York City were actually introduced from Europe. But once again, generally speaking, those changes don't result in a virus that's totally different. And I think the rate that's been described for SARS-CoV-2, this novel coronavirus, is about half as frequent as the influenza virus. And it's like, I think the number was like about 2 mutations a month. So yes, the virus can change. It can always change, but it's not changing as rapidly as it could. That's a great topic, though. And Keaton Smith, I appreciate the super hearts. Are we just talking about COVID-19 or all things mind and heart? Anything on your agenda? I'll do my best to be as insightful as I can be. Does that mean everyone needs to be vaccinated? Well, ideally. I mean, a vaccine is basically like using the body's military system by like promoting the military system, right? So like that is essentially giving your body the ability to recognize SARS-CoV-2 and fight it off, right? That would be like, that's extremely useful. That is like the silver bullet in the quiver of biomedical science to treat viral infections. The problem is that it takes a long time to make them. It takes like over a year. In fact, when we're not in a pandemic, it can take much longer than a year. But we're, because there's a bunch of different changes that have occurred in FDA policy, that timeline has been pretty dramatically expedited for, several different vaccine candidates for SARS-CoV-2. But a vaccine isn't the only potential tool that in the tool belt of physicians to treat SARS-CoV-2. And I talked on the YouTube just earlier before I went live here, youtube.com/anthropoid, about one of those efforts. It's basically like scanning a huge, thousands of compounds, thousands of potential molecules, finding ones that have already been clinically approved. FDA approved, meaning that we know that they're reasonably safe. We know that they're reasonably effective for whatever condition they're used to treat. And so therefore we don't have to be worried that like, okay, this might interfere with SARS-CoV-2, with preventing COVID-19. But it turns out that it also causes kidney failure, right? We wouldn't have to be worried about that. Or at least we would know what to expect. And then what they're doing is using a bunch of automated technologies to very rapidly test if these molecules might interact with the virus and interfere with its ability to replicate itself. So that's happening. And if they're successful, that would mean that we could have a potential therapeutic within, like several months rather than well over a year. So yeah. How about Alzheimer's? If your grandmom has it and your mom has it, I will get it too. There is no vaccine. What's quite interesting about that? Well, so first of all, you're right. So there is definitely a genetic component to Alzheimer's disease. There's a genetic component to essentially all dementia. Unfortunately, we still are not in a place where we can identify what those genetic precursors or predisposing factors are. We know some of them, but the ones with which we're familiar only explain a small minority of Alzheimer's patients. And generally speaking, these are patients that have very aggressive Alzheimer's disease, and it progresses very rapidly and early. I'm talking about the ApoE4 mutation, if you're familiar with that. But there are definitely other genetic components to making either somebody vulnerable to developing Alzheimer's disease or inevitably developing Alzheimer's disease. And so it's interesting that you say that there's no vaccine. I mean, you're right. You're absolutely right. However, one of the most innovative potential approaches to treating Alzheimer's disease was essentially using the immune system, believe it or not. Not quite a vaccine, but rather it's sort of like a vaccine. It's basically like training the immune system to recognize the 2' aggregates, the signature of Alzheimer's disease, amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, essentially training the immune system to attack those plaques and tangles and remove them. And that strategy has been attempted several times over the past 2 decades. And unfortunately, they haven't proven to be particularly effective in reducing symptoms of dementia. I do kind of suspect that the pharmaceutical industry is probably going to start to abandon that strategy. But and there are other potential treatments for Alzheimer's. But it's just interesting that you brought up vaccine. Okay, we have a caller. Couldn't connect. That's too bad. Try calling in again. My father died from a brain tumor. Could I get it too? So certainly, there is certainly a genetic component to cancer, and you know, we can't explain. Biomedical scientists can't explain why it is that everybody develops cancers. In some cases, there are like known mutations that amplify somebody's risk to develop cancer considerably, like the P50 mutation, for example. And other mutations that are, generally speaking, in parts of cellular systems that can monitor for aberrant cellular activity. So essentially, like, this cell has a funky protein on its surface, the immune system then attacks. So yeah, but generally speaking, like, I think one of the most useful models to explain cancer is the multi-hit hypothesis or the two-hit hypothesis, where yes, you have a genetic predisposition to cancer, but then you also have to be exposed environmentally to something that triggers, carcinogenic activity, right? So in other words, like, you have a predisposing factor that you inherited, but it just so happened that your mom and your grandmother, I believe, right? Or your father maybe. It just so happened that they grew up in an area where there was a lot of industrial pollution. This is actually the case in part of my family, where part of my family grew up in Massachusetts. They had a big family, big Irish Catholic family. And I don't know if it was particularly big for that time. It was like 5 siblings, so it was pretty big. But anyways, essentially, so my well, without getting too specific, one of my parents ended up leaving that area much earlier than their siblings, just at the beginning, essentially, of puberty. And essentially, this member of my family is the only one who did not develop cancer, the only one. And we know that, particularly in the part of Massachusetts in which they lived, there was a lot. It was essentially where the Industrial Revolution began in the United States, I guess in the world. And so as a result, it's an interesting potential concern if maybe there are just some residual carcinogenic, pollutants that just haven't been remediated. That's just one example. But like, another example is like, smoking cigarettes definitely increases your risk of developing lung cancer. Not a question, right? But not everybody does develop lung cancer when they smoke. It's an interesting, curiosity, right? It could be the case that for somebody with a genetic predisposition to cancer, if they never smoke, but their family members who did develop cancer did smoke, and therefore you're not exposed to carcinogens that they were exposed to, perhaps you never develop cancer. This is kind of like a principle that is operative at multiple levels of biology. Like, for example, it's operative, we're pretty sure, in addiction, where, like, okay, we know for sure, at least in some cases, you can inherit genes that predispose you to nicotine addiction or to alcoholism or to opioid addiction. But once again, so you have that predisposition, but if you're never exposed to nicotine, never exposed to alcohol or opioids, you're not going to become addicted to those drugs, right? So it's what is really a gene environment interaction. That is what determines the ultimate outcome, regardless of, irrespective of genetic precursors. Ian, can you answer my question though? Yes. I know you keep trying to call in and it's not working. Oh wait, are you still trying to call in? Let's see. Oh wait, no, the other person is trying to call in. I do see your topic though. And Irene, I see you're calling in too. We'll see if this first one connects. Otherwise, it might be the case that there's something wrong with the call-in feature, which would be heartbreaking. It's like my favorite part. Just talking to you guys. What's going on here? No, didn't work. All right, let's see if we can connect to Irene. Boop, boop. Looks like we are. Irene, I assume that's your name. Where are you calling from?
Hey, I'm calling from Beverly Hills.
Irene in Beverly Hills, awesome. What's on your mind?
I hate niggers.
It's very cute. That was such a California call. So I went to college in California, and like, you can just hear it. Like, you just sort of hear like this really slow way to talk, and then the laugh, like, it's like such a California laugh. Man, imagine that being your existence. Like, what you're doing is going on social media. Somebody's talking about science, and your goal is to say a naughty word. Oh my gosh. So funny. What a waste of consciousness. All right. Let's see if we connect this time. Otherwise, so we were able to, fortunately for us, we were able to connect to Irene, but unfortunately it doesn't seem like we're able to connect Head Game Pro. But I see your question, so maybe we'll connect. But how do you explain how people who are the most disabled turn out to be geniuses such as Stephen Hawking's? So yeah, that's a really interesting topic. So first of all, Stephen Hawking didn't have the biological challenges that he had were not in the brain. Well, they were in the nervous system, but they didn't affect his cognition, right? So there's a significant difference in, both Alzheimer's disease and Lou Gehrig's disease are severely debilitating, but they're arising from different parts of the body. And it just so happens to be the case that in the case of Alzheimer's disease, the parts of the body that are deteriorating are involved in cognition, and that's why they present with dementia. For multiple sclerosis, or for whatever, essentially any malady outside of the brain, it can be debilitating. You can get to the point where you can't walk, but your brain is intact. Your brain is not affected by that pathology outside of the brain. And in fact, this is partly due to the blood-brain barrier. A lot of things in the body can't actually gain access to the brain because it's much more difficult to gain access to the brain than it is other parts of the body. So, I mean, generally speaking, that's it. There's probably also an interesting psychological argument where for somebody who can't, a lot of things that you and I do in our lives are inaccessible to them, right? They can't just go walk out to a bar. It takes so much effort that it's not worth it, or, go to sporting events or whatever, things to which they might otherwise devote some time, they devote to something else. And perhaps in some people's cases, it might be cosmology, physics or mathematics or whatever it is. So they just devote more cognitive horsepower to a subject where, you could learn it, I could learn it. But, we would inevitably spend less time doing it. I don't know, I'm not saying that I necessarily even believe that argument, but, I think there's an interesting psychological argument to be made there. I have to leave. Thank you for the session. My pleasure, Salima. Thanks for coming in. Okay, I lost my memory from an injury at Ford Motors. Now lots of racist stuff. People dead in Chicago. I'm not quite sure. I'm following. Is it normally tumors that cause this type of deformity? I'm not quite sure what deformity you're referencing. Why are people still making fun of mental illness when the brain is an organ that controls the body? Yeah, it's Lulu. I mean, so certainly it's baffling to me. But, I think as Homo sapiens, right? Homo sapiens or the consciousness of humans is not perfect. It's actually pretty far from perfect, but it just happens to be just good enough for us to accomplish all the things that we have in front of us. But Homo sapiens are not very good at empathizing with the suffering of other people very, very far away from them, with whom they never interact, with whom they have no contact. They don't know any member of those communities, and so on. And so I think it's just very difficult for a lot of people to, essentially develop a theory of mind, to try and even imagine what it's like to suffer from a malady that they've never even encountered. I think particularly when it comes to psychiatric conditions, because of course these emerge from different patterns of brain activity in the brain, invisible, right? We have no way to see it other than their behavioral manifestations, their suffering. And so that's why I think a lot, and also, I mean, neuroscience is a much younger discipline than a lot of other scientific disciplines. And so, as a result, we still are trying to understand conditions like addiction or depression or PTSD. I think it is far better today than when I was younger. There is like a broader appreciation for post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. And perhaps largely due to the opioid addiction epidemic, there is a broader appreciation for the nature of addiction, that it's not just like a moral failure or, a failure of willpower. It's more complicated than that. And so, I do think that we're making progress, but at the heart of it, I think, is just the suboptimal capability to empathize with people that you never see, you never, interact with. That's what I think. I could be wrong. Okay. Oh, weird. Not able to connect to chat. Please try again later. Oh, that's too bad. Let's see. Oh, no. It looks like we're okay. All right. Beverly Hills Girl just reminded me of how they get down. Brain injury causes memory loss, but Ford Motors doesn't believe me. Now everybody dead around this boy. Oh, now everybody dead around this boy. I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, I wish I could help you there. Please accept my call. I'm trying, Head Game Pro. Oh, wait. We have two callers. Okay, let's see if this works. Oh, looks like we connect. Okay. What's your name and where are you calling from?
I'm actually in here.
Awesome.
So my name is RJ. Well, that's just my nickname because I'm majoring in architecture and design.
Awesome.
But something that I was so upset with what that lady did.
Yeah.
And it's very offensive because I really do have black friends and things like that. So I kind of feel like it's very rude for her to come in here and be so ignorant and immature and call people the N-word. And the thing is, one person asked if racism is actually something that is something that's in your brain, but I don't think it is. I mean, this is just something that you have a choice of whether you're going to hate someone or discriminate someone based off of their own color. So it's not something that is like a psychological thing. It's actually a choice of whether you want to treat someone that way, in my opinion.
Yeah, broadly speaking, you're right. I mean, there is really interesting biology that is relevant to the topic of racism as well as race. Happy to get into that if you like, but broadly speaking, I think you're absolutely right. Exercise your frontal lobes. But honestly, dude, she was just trying to get a rise out of people. I doubt she even believes what she's saying. So anyways, what else is on your mind?
Well, I guess when you talk about psychological, could you think that, I know this is going to be very difficult, and I assume because you're probably really rich that you may even be a Trump supporter yourself, but...
No way, no. Dude, I am not very rich.
Well, I'm just, you said you're a neuroscientist?
Yeah.
Well, you're going to after you pay off those student loans. But,
So, well, I mean, not really. So neuroscientists are scientists, right? Generally speaking, you don't go into science if you want to make a lot of money. You make a comfortable living. I mean, I'm not, certainly not impoverished, but, nothing like what a neurologist or a neurosurgeon makes. This is academia. But anyways, yeah, I'm not particularly wealthy. So, but what else?
My question is, do you think that the whole idea, I know again it's hard to talk about politics, but do you believe that it's a mentality of why Trump can lie so much, and then the idea how, I know it's hard, but the idea how somebody can be so against what you stand for and believe in, but you still support them, like many people with Trump, because Trump is constantly working against those same people who voted him into office. So whether it be, not being for small businesses, whether it be being terrible for the farmers, which there's plenty of evidence for that, whether it be, being terrible for those who are really sick and stuff like that, but people still thought that he would be great for that, helping people who are needing work and things like that. So I'm just wondering, if he's been fighting against the very people who voted for him, why is it that people still love him the way that they do?
Yeah, I mean, so it's an interesting topic. I'm certainly not a political scientist, but so here's where I think we can dig our toes into the sand a little bit. And actually, I did several podcast episodes about this. Podcast is called Wired to Be Weird, but not about this specific topic, but broadly or more the relationship between biology, genetic inheritance, society, and political affiliation. There's a lot of interesting research, but the short story is that political affiliation really is not as rational a manifestation of behavior, or as rational, thought through a choice as we kind of, I think, intuitively appreciate or intuitively assume. For example, and I think this probably is intuitive to a lot of people, but party affiliation is very predictable by what your family party affiliation is. There's some interesting neuroimaging studies that do identify different patterns of responses to stimuli among people who self-identify as, liberal or as conservative. But at the heart of it, and I'm not even necessarily agreeing with your characterization there, but I think, at the heart of the topic you're bringing up is, why is it that in any case somebody would behave in a way that's not in their best interest? What's that? Go ahead.
It's like blind faith, but one thing that it's like where you can follow someone unwaveringly, it doesn't really matter what they do or say. But my question is actually another one. You said that it's about the family and it's about who you're brought up with, but if that's the case, how do you explain so many fallen Catholics? Because there's plenty of Catholics that, they were raised to be Catholic their entire life, and then they turn 18, and then they become atheists, things like that. And there's also, I don't know how this works, but, even when it comes to Kellyanne Conway, we haven't heard of her for a very long time. Like, Kellyanne Conway, her own husband is I don't know if he's a Democrat or not, but he definitely does not like Trump at all. Now, imagine being the assistant to the president in which your own husband absolutely hates. So how do you explain things like that?
I mean, this is probably where we should finish up, but I suspect that the Conway household, George Conway and Kellyanne Conway, they're operatives. I think that they are playing a game and they're very adept at it. And it'll be interesting to see how George Conway and Kellyanne Conway evolve out after this administration. But once again, I said that party affiliation studies show that party affiliation is very predictable based off of familial associations, but it's not 100% predictable. I think once again, right, humans are really, really bad at understanding why we do the things we do. Generally speaking, what happens is that we are succumbing to urges or navigating urges, and then essentially we rationalize the behavior that we executed. We come up with an explanation afterwards. And so, political affiliation, political decision making is, not primarily rational. Of course, we have rational, faculties, and people have different life experiences that'll predispose them to one behavior over another. But yeah, at the heart of it is that it's just not driven by rational cognition.
Okay, so that's how you can support somebody who doesn't actually support or put any policies in place that help you.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, right, but I'm sure there are plenty. I would imagine that the folks who you're identifying, they do not think that they are voting against their best interests. The same goes for, people in the Democratic Party, where there are a bunch of policies that theoretically they wouldn't support, economic policies, but they don't see it that way, right? It's not how those kind of decisions are made. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other research related to politics. I find politics very interesting, and I find the science of politics very interesting. But just one more thing that you might be interested in. So it turns out that we can, better than chance, predict who's going to win an election by just looking at black and white images of the two candidates. We can predict better than chance. We can also predict with which party each one affiliates. We can also do that better than chance by looking at pictures of people's eyes and eyebrows. So you don't have to see the whole face.
I think that Joe Biden he fits that old, Republican type of look. So I don't really think you could say that he looks like a Democrat. I think Democrats, in my opinion, you'd think if you're just talking about a Democrat, it'd be normally the younger people. And then the Republicans, they feel like older people, because that's really how the party is. Mostly.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I would like to see the evidence that would back that up. But anyways, I think we've exhausted my ability.
Right, and I know that politics is hard, but I got one more quick question. So this has nothing to do with politics. I know it's hard. I love talking about this. I really do. But what about people who are gay? So, because you said that it has to do with the whole family, but again, you could have a very, very strict mother and a very, very strict dad and still turn out to be super gay and then, be very rebellious against your own family. So I don't think that, people can say, oh, they had someone's mom could be like, oh, I would never raise a gay son. That's the thing, nobody can actually predict. I wonder what makes someone gay. What do you think
Wow.
that is? Do you really think it's chromosomes? Like, what do you think that is? What if they're bisexual? What if they're just free in general and there's no labels? Like, how do you explain that? Like, what is there a way to explain that? Is it you know?
Do we have an explanation? Yeah, I mean, well, this is obviously one of the most heated topics in science. And, you know, basically, like, this question of, like, sexual preference in humans, frankly, from the biology that we have at our disposal, sexual attraction in humans is very, very complicated. It's not just like an on switch or an off switch. It's not just one part of the brain. It's not just one gene that determines whether or not somebody's homosexual or heterosexual, or something in between. It's a constellation of these predisposing factors and then life experience that will collaborate to determine the nature of one's sexual attraction. So it's more complicated than just like, yeah, like you said, it's not just your chromosomes, or it's not like you had a strict, mother and father and therefore you're more rebellious. It's more complicated than all of that. But anyways, you're bringing up really complicated questions and I appreciate it, but I should probably let some other people join in.
Okay. Hey, I want to let you know, Ian, thank you so much for letting me get the chance to talk. I know it was some controversial things that a lot of people weren't trying to hear, but I want to let you know, thank you so much for this. Thank you so much, Ian, and I hope you have a great day, and I love your stream. I love it. Okay?
Likewise, man. Thanks for calling in.
Yep.
I mean, these are a lot of these things. Not so much homosexuality on the podcast, but the politics and the relationship between politics and race and life experience we've actually discussed on the podcast in some depth. So Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher. Okay, you can. All right. Wow, yeah, you definitely incited some controversy in the chat. I love it. Okay, some people hate so much they will shoot themselves in the foot. Is this guy a teacher? No, I'm a scientist. I led a recitation of college students in intro neuroscience. It's hard doing good, ain't it? But the reward is phenomenal. Actually, that's an interesting way to phrase it. I mean, like, essentially, one of the main parts of the human brain that distinguishes it from other primate brains is an increased capacity to doing just that, to determining whether or not a certain more difficult endeavor is worth greater effort, greater time, because of an anticipated greater reward, right? Humans are actually pretty good at doing that. We're not perfect, of course, never are, but having a prefrontal cortex, having frontal lobes, enables us to scrutinize potential decisions, and I'm using that word quite loosely, for their potential value, their potential payoff. And so instead of doing the easy thing for a known smaller reward, we can evaluate using this fancy frontal lobe that we evolved as Homo sapiens to pursue the harder option because it'll pay off more. Baby. Oh my God, seriously, this physician giving an opinion on politics in conjunction with brain function. So I'm not a physician, I'm a scientist. And it's something that I've discussed in the past. There is actual neuroscience research, peer-reviewed, on everything that I mentioned. I certainly am not, diagnosing any, modern politics or anything like that. All of that research is based off of, I think the furthest away in time was like 2011. But they did like multiple election cycles. Just check it out. Maybe you find those data particularly unconvincing, and that's fair enough. That's why I talk about it on the podcast. Podcast is called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher. Everywhere pretty much. Okay, this call's first on the last. All right. Yes, you're invited, but he's to get there through the digital realm. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. But we have a new caller. Cinevision, what's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there?
Hey, my name's Josh. I'm calling from Los Angeles.
Oh, Josh in LA. Yeah. Okay. What's on your mind?
You were just talking about the whole decision where people, are starting to basically take the road less traveled in their decisions because the payoff will be higher. What about when it comes down to, like, if the road less traveled leads to I guess, pain or danger. So, like, are there people who are able to basically manage like that fear and like have calculated risks in their head, knowing that, say, you know, the people who are putting themselves in danger, say like parkour people or like people who are you know, hanging off of cranes or something like that, like, do they actually have like a lower fear like built into their brain, or is it something that's been normalized throughout their practice?
Super interesting topic. So, you know, we in neuroscience and in psychology, we have a name for these kinds of folks who engage in high risk behaviors, and so, you know, generally speaking, risk seekers. That is one way to describe them. But what we know is that, or some evidence suggests that some people they react to their activation of their sympathetic nervous system, their fight or flight reaction. Some people find that much more aversive than others. Some people find it quite rewarding. And, you know, neurophysiologically, what it's more complicated than this always, but we're talking about a pretty substantial escalation of a signaling of a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. That, you know, neurotransmitter essentially helps to prepare somebody for a survival situation. So, for example, you're hanging off of, you know, a scaffolding of a skyscraper, your sympathetic nervous system is definitely activated, right? Because, you know, and essentially what it's doing is, you know, mobilizing blood out to the extremities. That's true if you're running away from a bear, or if you put yourself in a compromising situation like that, or if you're giving a talk in front of a lot of people, right? But that's literally making you more like stronger, making you more capable of holding on. But anyway, so that is like the sort of fundamentals of what's going on in the brain of somebody who's engaging in risky behavior. But we know there's evidence from just like neuroimaging, but then also pharmacologically speaking, some people find drugs that amplify norepinephrine signaling actually rewarding in a way that other people would find like icky and scary and just irritating, aggravating. And in fact, there's even some neuropharmacologists who argue that while, you know, methamphetamine is a central nervous system stimulant, psychostimulant, and its principal neuropharmacology is elevating dopamine signaling. But like pretty much all central nervous system stimulants, it also elevates norepinephrine signaling pretty substantially. And there are some neuropharmacologists who make the argument, and they have evidence to suggest it, that at least in some people, they actually find the elevation of norepinephrine the principally rewarding feature. That's the thing that's driving them to continue taking the drug, and not so much the dopamine signaling. All of this to say that if you let's say you have a brain that finds that fight or flight reaction really fun, right? Really rewarding. Then when you are evaluating any potential behavior, the cost that you're weighing is much lower than for somebody who finds, you know, activation of their fight or flight reaction less aversive, or that finds it more aversive. So, you know, the cost for me, if I find it super aversive, it's going to be much higher anticipated cost than somebody like you who would have a lower aversion to fight or flight.
So then you can normalize it, right? So if I continue to go up there and that becomes like my environment, does that then, you know, can that transfer over into everyday things? Like, I feel, because I did parkour for a really long time, and I've done these things, and I definitely felt like heights became normalized to me, like really, really normal, to the fact where like, I don't know, yeah, I just like, I kind of forgot that fight or flight, and it just became something that, you know, felt like it was an everyday thing. You know, I could just stand up there and like stay calm. It was like, that's what I was addicted to, was like the pursuit of having it feel normal, you know?
Very interesting. Josh, were you then driven to engage in other, you know, objectively risky behavior?
Yeah, but it was something that I felt like I had a healthy approach to. So like maybe if I did, then I would, you know, study it at a safe, in a safe way until I got to that. It was more like I was addicted to the the controlling of my, my emotion, my fear, rather than like the activities.
That's very interesting. I mean, yes. So fundamentally, this topic that you're bringing up, yes, you can become desensitized to a variety of environments, and in fact, there are entire psychological therapies that revolve around. Essentially, they're called exposure therapy. This is sometimes used to treat PTSD.
Right.
And so, yeah, you can become desensitized to it. Now, what I am unsure of is whether or not, that's the reason I ask you that question, is whether or not desensitizing to one environment, like let's say standing at the top of a skyscraper, whether or not that generalizes, whether or not that desensitizes your noradrenergic system, broadly speaking, so that then you'll drive at 120 miles an hour, where most people would kind of freak out a little bit. Maybe for somebody who's desensitized to heights, maybe they're just not as affected by it. I don't have an answer for that. I could imagine that being the case, but
do you know if there's people who don't have to work to normalize it, people who are born with less of that fear, with that less of that fight or flight instinct?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. I mean, there are definitely variations in there are variations in the architecture of our brain, right? You have a different brain, broadly speaking, we have the same brain regions, but there are microscopic differences that distinguish our brains, and that distinguishes why, you behave in one way, and then in the same situation, I would behave in another. And some of that variation absolutely can influence things like sensitivity to fight or flight. It can result in variations in one's ability to empathize, and, creating a sort of context for behaviors or cognition that resembles like psychopathy or sociopathy, where you're just not as affected by seeing images of people suffering, for example. And in fact, interestingly enough, those folks who score higher on like a scale of psychopathy also respond to pain, their own pain, less significantly, right? You can measure.
That's definitely true for me.
Interesting, huh?
Yeah, that's weird. Has there been any studies like throughout a duration of studying someone like that, where they say they start out pretty normal and they get into an extreme sport, or not even if it's an extreme sport, but like something that's dangerous to them, or I don't know, just something that they're not used to, and then going throughout time and looking at how their brain develops as they become more comfortable with it? Has there been like studies on that?
That's another super interesting topic. I have to assume that there are probably studies that have done that. Like for example, following like professional skydivers, or there's like a very specific example that I know has been documented where people who for whatever reason they were evaluated for psychological health, and then they have a stroke, and after the stroke it turns out that their scores on empathy decrease very significantly. So in other words, they sort of developed some elements of psychopathy due to specific parts of the brain being damaged by the stroke. But that's a very specific example. But like over time, I bet those studies have been done, but unfortunately I haven't read them.
Gotcha. All right, cool, man. Thanks for chatting. It's interesting.
My pleasure, man. Thanks for calling in.
Yeah.
Man, like, I'm sure many of you have seen the videos that Josh was referencing, where like they're quite common in Russia for whatever reason, but people will like go out on scaffolding, it's like hundreds of feet in the air, and they'll just sort of like hang off, and then like I've seen them like remove fingers. It's just like, my sympathetic nervous system is being significantly activated. Like I sometimes will just can't, like have to look away. I guess that reveals a little bit about my fight or flight neurophysiology. But super interesting topic. Okay. Oh, Claire, good to see you in here. All right. Let's see. Oh, and I see Alec is in here. Good to see you, my friend. The dapperest gentleman on the internet. That's MewApp, by the way. Okay. Stripper Scott, I see you are in here as well. Is that why my shrink put me on an SNRI? The N is for norepinephrine, right? Yeah. So generally speaking, like SNRI, selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, they're obviously very similar to SSRIs, but obviously they target a different neurotransmitter that's actually rather different in terms of its sort of like regulation of consciousness. And sometimes like Wellbutrin, for example, is an SNRI. Sometimes it is prescribed on its own. It's actually, in some cases, prescribed to treat nicotine addiction. But other times it's used in conjunction with another antidepressant, like a Prozac or a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, because a side effect of that class of drugs is feeling very groggy and slow and cognitively sluggish, and amplifying noradrenergic signaling or norepinephrine signaling can help to compensate for that and sort of provide a little bit more energy. In fact, I've seen that some folks actually quite enjoy the effects of selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. But actually, speaking to my conversation with Josh just now, some people find it, appetitive. Some people find it not rewarding. That's not quite the right word, but pleasant, useful. But other people find it extremely aversive, and they can even have like panic attacks, anxiety attacks. They can even have bouts of psychosis. And so, so it's interesting. People respond to noradrenergic signaling in very different ways. All right, I had Wellbutrin at first. Now it's Cymbalta. Yeah, similar. Can we talk about dementia? Of course, it'd be my pleasure. Thank you so much, Claire, for the super heart. It is wonderful to see you. Oh, by the way, so in case you're in the unlikely scenario that you're unfamiliar with Claire Means, she is a wonderful singer-songwriter. Check her out. Is social anxiety a symptom of dysfunction in the brain? Can mushrooms help to fix your brain chemistry? Okay, yeah, interesting topic. So the first topic, topic is, social anxiety produced in the brain? Absolutely. In fact, that is the main part of the body from which it emerges. Not exclusively, though. So, for example, another component of anxiety attacks or anxiety in general is actually the peripheral manifestation of anxiety. When I say peripheral, I mean outside of the central nervous system, outside of the brain and spinal cord. So, for example, you feel the anxiety. That happens first, or arguably it happens first. Your sympathetic nervous system is activated, and as I was saying again once again with Josh, your sympathetic you have just non-specific sympathetic nervous system activation, meaning that like all of your survival mechanisms are kicking into high gear. Your heart is pumping to make sure you get more blood out to your extremities. Your blood is mobilized to your extremities. You start sweating. You are potentially a little bit hyperlocomotive. You can be a little bit jittery, prompting you to be able to respond with locomotion more efficiently, right? But so you're anxious, something is causing anxiety in you, but then you also are sort of monitoring, consciously or subconsciously monitoring changes in your body, and you're like, oh, my palms are sweaty. What is it? Mom spaghetti. That you start feeling like the things that only happen when you're anxious, and that sort of amplifies the anxiety response. So that's why it's not exclusively the brain, but it is principally the brain. And so, and then the other thing, can mushrooms help to fix your brain chemistry? You're sort of making an assumption there, which is social anxiety disorder is just a byproduct of a chemical imbalance. That's a very commonly used phrase. Unfortunately, it's rather outdated at this point. Earlier on, several decades ago, neuroscience really did kind of focus either on action potential firing in specific neurons, impulses, or levels of neurotransmitters, neurochemistry. Now we are more concerned with the activities of assemblages of neurons, of networks of neurons interacting with one another in disparate parts of the brain. So in other words, not just like this is the anxiety center of the brain. That's not really how it works. Rather, there's a circuit of neurons that increases one's propensity towards anxiety. So I only bring this up to say that just solving neurochemistry or a chemical imbalance is not actually going to solve the problem. It's more complicated than that. You're really trying to modify the behaviors of neurons, specific neurons. However, can psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, I assume those are the mushrooms that you're referring to, not like portobello. Although who knows, maybe portobello and reishi mushrooms are like really good for anxiety. I doubt it. But psilocybin-containing psychedelic mushrooms are being evaluated for potential utility in psychiatric contexts, specifically for PTSD, as well as end-of-life psychiatric, things like depression. And they've shown to be pretty effective. They haven't reached the point where it's like definitely, they're in like phase 4 clinical trials or anything, where they're just, they know it's super effective. They're just monitoring for, any potential problems in the broader population. Not even close to that. But if you're familiar, you might be familiar with, if you're interested in this topic, you might be interested in a group called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. It's a really interesting organization. I actually met the CEO many, many years ago when I lived in Colorado for a short period of time in Boulder. I didn't live in Boulder, but that's where I met him. Rick Doblin. They have recently completed 2 phases of clinical trials for the use of MDMA for the treatment of PTSD. And I think that either they've already started their phase 3 clinical trial, which is really like the last major hurdle that any drug has to pass to be able to be used clinically, legally. And so, the last I checked, they were like close to 99% funded for their phase 3 clinical trials, which are extraordinarily expensive. It costs on average something like, well, this is now like 10 years ago, well over $1 billion to bring any drug from soup to nuts, from conception to, in your physician's hand. And so there's that. And now the neuropharmacology of MDMA is certainly not identical to psilocybin, but they're somewhat similar. They both modify serotonin signaling. They both interact with a specific serotonin receptor called the 5-HT2A receptor. Now, of course, MDMA also is essentially a serotonin releasing agent. It induces the release of serotonin. Psilocybin does modify serotonin trafficking, but it doesn't do it by the same mechanism. Okay. And so these are different drugs, but they do converge on more similar circuits than let's say memantine and psilocybin, or and memantine and MDMA. So all of this to say, it might be the case that psilocybin-containing mushrooms might be useful for the management of certain anxiety-associated conditions. I would be a little bit skeptical that they would be beneficial in all contexts. Rather, I think really what MAPS has been doing, and what the group evaluating psilocybin for the treatment of psychiatric illnesses that arise, in things like terminal cancer, that is being headed up by a group at the Langone Medical Center for Medicine or whatever, the medical school at NYU, New York University. But so I think what they're doing is like for a very specific patient population, it might be the case that psilocybin is like uniquely beneficial, whereas for other patient populations, it could be detrimental or just ineffective, or there are just better options out there. So we're still sort of in that stage. But the take home of this long screed is that all psychiatric illnesses are not just the byproduct of a chemical imbalance. It's, you can't say that serotonin is the depression neurotransmitter or dopamine is the reward neurotransmitter. By the way, that's not even close to right. Rather, that it's a circuit of neurons that's implicated in any given psychiatric illness. Okay. I'm not seeing the YouTube comment. Yeah, it looks like maybe I am logged out. Sorry, I can't. It looks like I'm missing a YouTube comment. Oh, and I've left this up for just like no good reason. Did I take it down? Yes, I did. Fantastic. Okay. What do you think about Jack Dorsey donating $1 billion of his net worth to fight coronavirus? I mean, I'll certainly take it. No, it's great. I mean, that's certainly more than a lot of people in his position have contributed. However, like, it's great. Like, I think he should be applauded. He's not as wealthy as other billionaires, and he's donating a more significant proportion of his wealth. He still has several billions left, but I don't think anybody would donate like all of their wealth to a specific problem. However, I wish that what we had in the United States rather was a more robust funding mechanism for preparative clinical health, right? Or clinical preparation. we had a vaccine over 10 years ago, about 10 years ago. No, 20 years ago? Yeah, like 20 years ago, after the first, the earlier coronavirus outbreak that caused SARS. A physician scientist named Peter Hotez, one of my ex-girlfriends, actually got her PhD in his lab. He's one of the most charming people in the world. He always reminded me, because he'd walk around the halls at Baylor College of Medicine. That's where I interacted with him extraordinarily briefly. I never took a class from him, but he had developed essentially a pipeline to develop a vaccine for SARS, and that could have definitely been repurposed to develop a vaccine much more rapidly for SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. But it was abandoned after the sort of outbreak of SARS died down. The funding available for that kind of work dried up, and the United States has historically been has identified biomedical science as a priority that's worthy of investment by the federal government. However, relative to other countries, funding for basic biomedical research relative to like a country's GDP is falling. And essentially, while the real numbers of like dollars devoted to biological research have grown, they haven't grown commensurate with like purchasing power, inflation. And so actually, what we've had are cuts to biomedical funding. And so it's wonderful that we have somebody like Jack Dorsey who sees this threat, sees the fact that we have the research available. Like we could solve this problem much more rapidly if we got all hands on deck. It's great that he's around, and it should be applauded. But what I would like to see is a more robust and predictable, less fickle funding mechanism for basic biomedical research. That then we wouldn't be in this position. There is no good reason that we should have the numbers of people infected with COVID-19 in this country. Like there is no good reason for that. And in fact, a group that was a collaboration between the Johns Hopkins, I think, School of Public Health. Johns Hopkins is one of the best medical schools in the world. Not as good as Penn, but no, I'm kidding. Actually, I think it is better. And then another group that's really devoted to like nuclear safety and stuff like that. But they collaborated to essentially rank how prepared different countries all around the world would be for a pandemic. And guess what country was ranked objectively as the most prepared? The United States. Guess which country was ranked as number 2? The United Kingdom. And both countries have had just a bafflingly bad response to this, and there's no good reason for it. And at least a part of it's more complicated than this. And I will abandon this soapbox in just a moment, but is the fact that we just have not been nurturing biomedical science as much as we have in the past. Okay. When do you think things will be back to normal? Well, it's impossible to say. It's sort of a surreal time in which we're living because, we are literally these conversations we're having are happening in the window of time that will determine when the end of COVID-19, when we can predict when the end will be, right? If we all, scrupulously practice social distancing or physical distancing or sheltering at home, depending upon what your local health authorities have implemented, depending on how good we are with this, it'll either take much, much longer or it'll be shorter. And most of the experts that I've seen that study, either epidemiology or just public health or infectious disease, they're anticipating that we will have, flattening the curve. Like, I'm sure you've heard of that concept, right? That's why we're doing social distancing, to basically, reduce the number of people who need medical care, hospitalization at any one given time. But what that also inevitably means is that it lasts for longer, right? That's literally the goal, is to make it so that rather than having to go to the hospital this week, you have to go to the hospital in 3 weeks. But that means that we're still dealing with this in 3 weeks, right? It is definitely the right thing to do. There's no question. But so, if we're not very good at this right now, then we're going to have to do this for longer. Anyways, yeah, okay. We are having a call from, I believe, a gentleman named Andrew Sabbath? Oh no, didn't connect. Try calling in. I know you've called a few times. I'm sorry about that. But I will keep my eye out. Claire, did you ever think this would happen in your lifetime? No, definitely not. And like I've studied, the Spanish flu epidemic, and not I don't have a degree in public health or anything, but of course, we study it. My initial degree was, I had to study immunology in grad school. It was a very difficult class, very interesting class, but anyways, so boring. I'm kidding. It's extremely fascinating. In fact, if I didn't go into neuroscience, I probably would have gone into immunology, or probably pharmacology, but immunology is very cool too. Anyways, yeah, I mean, like, not only did I never think that we would have an epidemic at this scale in my lifetime, nobody did. Nobody thought that in the United States that this was going to happen when it did. I mean, yes, of course, people predict, like, we could have a flu strain that is, highly infectious and highly, has a high mortality rate, higher than, your typical seasonal flu. Yeah, I mean, it was going to happen at some time. But so first of all, that had happened, surprising, although we shouldn't be surprised, right? So, for example, we've essentially had a coronavirus outbreak basically for every decade for the past 3 decades, right? Just basically every decade. Every decade since the early 2000s. SARS, and then the next decade, MERS, and then now, COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2. So it's basically every decade. So I guess we should just, next time around, prepare for, the next decade, just anticipate, all right, be ready for the next coronavirus. And once again, I mean, like, because, like that part was predictable. What was not predictable was that it would take so long for adequate testing to be implemented. And in fact, there are interviews of that group that ranked the different countries' preparedness. And they said that, like, the one thing that we could not have imagined was that the United States would not implement wide-scale testing like they did in South Korea. Partially because biomedical research in the United States is an extremely dominant presence. It's, the best biomedical institutions in the world are in the United States. So it's baffling. It's so surprising it's not surprising that it happened. It's surprising that it's even this bad. All right. Do you think more research should go into tau or amyloid beta? So Emily is bringing up Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is associated with 2 principal molecular signatures, amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. Amyloid beta plaques are aggregates of amyloid beta. Neurofibrillary tangles, however, are aggregates of, they're tangles, of hyperphosphorylated tau. Tau is essentially like the metal of scaffolding, right? It's like the little pieces of scaffolding that are then assembled to form a scaffold. What tau does is it sort of like secures down cytoskeletal components of neurons. So basically like the scaffolding of a neuron. But in some cases when somebody's developing Alzheimer's disease, something goes wrong with their, with how that little factor is processed, and it becomes hyperphosphorylated, and then it's sort of like, you have a little seed of lint in your pocket. Over time, it just grows and grows and grows. That's kind of what happens with neurofibrillary tangles and hyperphosphorylated tau. To date, most Alzheimer's research has honed in and focused on amyloid beta. There are a lot of interesting reasons for that. For a long time, the sort of prevailing hypothesis was that it is amyloid beta plaque accumulation that then drives neurofibrillary tangle accumulation. So there were many years where that was a sort of prevailing model. That's no longer the case. Now I don't think anybody makes a very strong argument that it's one or the other that is essential. Part of the reason for why there was so much more focus on amyloid beta was that for the longest time, we just could not generate a preclinical model that would actually have both amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. So you could have a mouse that would have amyloid beta plaques but not neurofibrillary tangles, or vice versa. It was like this conundrum. That problem has been solved more recently. But frankly, I think both should be studied. They're both among the dementias, both of them at the same time are uniquely associated with Alzheimer's disease, there's got to be something to that. And they're different biochemical cascades that result in amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. Very complicated, will require a lot of scientists working on this problem, and so I don't think we have to choose. I think both should be studied, as well as some of the other things that are also being emphasized today, which are more like preventative things, like lifestyle factors, diet, exercise, cognitive challenge, these kinds of things. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia. It is a worldwide, a huge challenge, and I think it warrants investment. Oops. And this problem is almost certainly going to be solved by basic biomedical scientists rather than a research or a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company, just because it's so expensive for a private sector entity to do that kind of research, and it's super high risk. I mean, it's taken us, this long to understand the molecular biology of Alzheimer's disease, and we still don't have even a moderately effective treatment. All right, gummies. Okay. What for CVS? CVS tried showing you CBD. Okay. Why am I prescribed Seroquel? Well, I can't tell you for sure. Seroquel is actually kind of an interesting drug. It's not like it doesn't have like more kind of restricted and specific pharmacology. It's more like so it has like a constellation of pharmacological targets, and so what we're talking about is quetiapine. I never know if I'm pronouncing that word right, but it targets the dopamine system, it targets serotonin receptors, it targets adrenergic receptors, and it targets histamine receptors, and even some acetylcholine receptors, specifically muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, which is like a weird little family of receptors. But it's used for a variety of things. It's an atypical antipsychotic, like that's its category, but it's used for more than just treating psychosis. It's used to treat, it's even used off-label, and this is kind of controversial actually. It's used off-label to help people go to sleep because one of its side effects is sleepiness. Which, I've definitely seen a lot of physicians say like that strikes us as incredibly reckless because like, that is like, it's just a side effect, and it's like not even remotely the only effect, right? You're manipulating so much other neurochemistry that yeah. Anyways, Eleonora, did I just see you? Good to see you in here. How are you? How are things over where you live? I don't want to get specific. Okay, girls' behavior. Can you show your wife for a moment? Maybe some viewers would calm down. No, we have decided to not only protect the privacy of my wife, but also my daughter, because she doesn't have a choice, right? Somebody has to protect her privacy, and I kind of suspect that her generation is going to be the last generation that even has the notion of privacy or anonymity, like as a thing, and that's like operative. So if we can preserve her privacy, then I feel like it's worth it. Okay. Well, girls' behavior. Oh, okay. He's rambling. Oh, I'm sorry. Kisama. How do people get Alzheimer's disease? Great question. The short answer is we don't quite know. No, well, we understand quite a bit about the sort of early stages of Alzheimer's disease. And like, okay, if you were to speak to most people in neuroscience and you were to ask them what causes Alzheimer's disease, they would probably say it's the aggregation of amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. Amyloid beta plaques outside of neurons, gunking up the outside, neurofibrillary tangles inside of neurons, screwing up, signaling and cellular biology. That's probably true, right? And you might ask, okay, why does that even happen? Well, the short answer is we know for some people. We know for a group of people that have a very specific mutation that they've inherited, and if they have 2 copies of this specific mutation, they are at risk of developing Alzheimer's disease as early as like 35 years old, which is very, very unusual. Generally speaking, it takes quite a while for somebody to develop dementia in general. but also Alzheimer's disease. The reason being, we think, that it takes a lot of time, or not a lot, it takes many years for those aggregates to even form, for amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles to form, because basically they're the byproduct of unlikely cellular errors that then and inside of your neurons, you even have systems that recognize when certain errors have occurred and compensates for them. Either like flags, an aberrantly folded protein, amyloid beta, flags it for degradation in this sort of like recycling system of neurons, a ubiquitin proteasome system, or there are other systems that can compensate for those errors. And so the sort of the rate of accumulation is mitigated by or reduced by those systems, but after a long enough period of time, those systems become overwhelmed, and that's how you get this aggregates. But it takes time for that to happen. Okay, so that was the I was referring to the ApoE4 mutation that can result in a rather aggressive Alzheimer's disease, but that only explains like single-digit percentages of Alzheimer's patients. We know that there are certain other mutations in different, like the gene that encodes the amyloid precursor protein, for example. There are certain enzymes that are involved in the actual like cleaving of the proteins that you can inherit slight mutations that may be the thing that results in the accumulation of amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, but we don't quite know yet, and it's extraordinarily difficult research, but we're getting closer. So those enzymes, I don't know if you could tell, I was trying to remember what those enzymes are called, secretases. Specifically gamma secretase. And there is the prospect of some new potential treatments for Alzheimer's disease that don't involve trying necessarily to clear out amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, but rather prevent their accumulation in the first place. Happy Easter to you too, Eleonora. Okay. You're rambling. No, you are. Good, thanks. We had the same, like the whole world. We are sitting at home. How are you? Yeah, same here. Eleonora doesn't live in the United States, by the way. Okay. Getting it. Oh, if people in your family have had Alzheimer's, are there things you can do to hopefully prevent, you getting it, or catch it? Yeah, right, getting it. That's a great topic. And so it seems to be the case that while we can't say specifically which environmental factors are the things that increase one's likelihood to develop dementia, it seems to be the case that there are definitely environmental factors that can be associated with it. Like I was talking about before I suspect before you got here, the multi-hit or the two-hit hypothesis of cancer, where it takes more than just a specific gene that it's more complicated than just like you inherited a gene that makes you more likely to develop cancer. Rather, it has to be a combination of this genetic predisposition and then an exposure to some kind of carcinogen that then causes cancer. In the case of Alzheimer's disease, might be the case that you inherit this genetic predisposition, and then you happen to consume a lot of simple carbohydrates. You eat your diet has a lot of sugar in it, or you're not particularly physically active. You're not athletic. You don't exercise very frequently, or you end up, as you get older, becoming more socially isolated. That happens quite frequently, particularly in the United States. As people get older, they don't have as many venues to socially interact with people. And then what's another one? Oh, and then another one is being cognitively challenged. As people get older, there can be a tendency to just sort of like to stop engaging in tasks or debates or just stimuli that contradict one's own worldview. And therefore, you're not stimulated by novel arguments. You're not forced to solve new problems. You're no longer, read a book. Indeed. But, if you only read books that you find that you agree with or with which you agree, or you find compelling already, or you're already familiar with them, maybe you've already read the books before. If you're only doing that, then you're not really getting the nutrition out of reading those books, right? It's not like just the act of reading a set of words is like therapeutic, right? Like, if I just wrote gibberish on a page and I handed it to you, it's not like you would have like, a therapeutic effect, right? And I'm sure, you were well aware of this. Anyways, so so essentially the reverse of all of those lifestyle factors seems to be associated with improved outcomes in dementia. So, for example, exercise, specifically cardiovascular exercise, mild to moderate, intense as well, but moderate intensity cardiovascular exercise several times a week, like 3 times a week for about 20 minutes or so, that has been associated with the reduced risk of dementia. Cognitively challenging oneself. A lot of studies use educational attainment as a kind of as a proxy. Hey, what's up, boss? Good to see you, man. As a kind of proxy for, just cognitive challenge, right? Just because it's a convenient thing to do, because if you're in some kind of educational program, theoretically, you're being forced to learn new things. Why else would you be there? And so it's just like a nice, easy, convenient way to measure that. But you don't have to continue to pursue education. You can just, educate yourself. It's still the same kind of thing. So I said physically active. I said cognitively challenging. Avoid social isolation. Make sure that you're, exposed to new people, or at least exposed to other people, somewhat regularly. That's obviously tough these days, right? But this isn't going to be our world for the rest of our lives. And then, there is like a dietary thing. Diets that are very high, as I noted, diets that are high in simple carbohydrates seem to be associated with a more aggressive onset of dementia. So avoid simple carbohydrates. There's really no good justifiable reason to eat sugar apart from it tasting really good, and experiencing pleasure is one of the pleasures of life. One of the reasons that being alive is so wonderful, right? So it's not like you can't eat anything that has sugar in it. But, what you should do is avoid using Coca-Cola or Sprite as your primary beverages, right? Treat those as candy bars, and treat candy bars as candy bars, and only use them, as a treat, right? Rather than like a daily, lovely, a daily part of your diet. Hey, what's up, Venom? 786 Venom. How am I? I'm doing okay. I'm a little sleep deprived because I'm packing, because we're gonna move pretty soon. We're still staying in my beloved Philadelphia, but a different part of my beloved Philadelphia, in a part that is perhaps a little bit more hospitable to a baby. I drink Cokes way too much. Yeah, when I was younger, I drank tons of soda. And then once I started getting more interested in like physical fitness and, weightlifting and stuff like that, I just learned that no, there's no good reason to drink those beverages. I don't even like it that much. So now I'm like a huge fizzy water guy. I'm a seltzer guy. Anyways, and I've actually speculated, this is pure speculation, I think that there's something to the chemistry of seltzer water, club soda, whichever one doesn't have salt, I think seltzer water, that makes it intrinsically more rewarding than water, even though all that's in there is water with some carbon dioxide molecules. And I have different ideas for why that is. I know some studies have suggested that the physical bubbling effect triggers quench, sensation of quench. But I suspect it's even more complicated than that. Anyways, so yeah, those things. One of the convenient things that probably checks off a lot of those boxes, and I'm a proponent of it because it's how I met my wife. It's how I met my baby's mother. Dance classes. Learn how to dance. And the dance classes that I went to, this was in Houston. They had people of all ages, and it was one of the nicest environments. There was no ageism whatsoever. So my point being, if you're, elderly, or if you're if you're older than I am, you can have a blast, doing dancing. And if you're younger than I am, same thing. It's a great way to meet a diverse group of people and learn a new thing. Learn how to dance. I would recommend, tango is awesome. Swing dancing. Ballroom dance. Yeah, I didn't do ballroom dancing. The reason I learned how to dance is because I have one of my closest friends in grad school was a competitive Scottish Highland dancing dancer, competitive Scottish Highland dancer, and literally she competed worldwide. But so she was really into Scottish Highland dancing, but pretty much everybody in that position learns all the other dances, and she was just there actually are pole dancing classes that you can take. I'm not saying anything, just saying. And they're actually it's gymnastics, literally what they do in those classes is gymnastics. It's really remarkably cool. But anyways, so she sort of said you must on this day go out, learn how to swing dance. And so I did. And that's how I met my baby's mother, my wife. All right. Can aluminum cookware cause Alzheimer's disease? Excellent question. The short answer is there's no evidence to suggest that it can. And I can tell you where that concern comes from. It's actually kind of an interesting oddity in the history, the annals of biomedical science. So, decades and decades ago, there was a scientist who was interested in the effects of aluminum salts in the brain. The guy injected some aluminum salts directly into the brains of some rabbits. Yes, some bunny rabbits. Lo and behold, it's bad. You don't want to do that. And he, upon evaluating the ramifications, the effects of that aluminum salt infusion, he found lesions in the brain, just under a microscope, nothing fancy, no fancy technology, just like, it's almost like just like a normal run-of-the-mill microscope that you might see in like a high school science class or something. And because the lesions that are induced by this aluminum injection looked a lot like the lesions that were seen in Alzheimer's disease patients, he said, this must be it. And there was other, little sort of threads of evidence. I've actually talked about this on the podcast called Wired to be Weird, an episode completely devoted to dementia. But there are some other bits of evidence, like, for example, certain mineral level regulation, like nutritional minerals, are dysregulated in Alzheimer's disease, in cerebrospinal fluid. So, okay, maybe there's something there. And after the Industrial Revolution, perhaps we've just been exposed to such greater concentrations of aluminum than people have in the past. The problem is that upon closer scrutiny, first of all, those lesions did not resemble the lesions that are observed in Alzheimer's disease. They were not amyloid beta plaques. They were not neurofibrillary tangles. And you don't have to have those two things to develop dementia, right? You can develop dementia by a bunch of different cellular, anomalies or abnormalities, like, frontotemporal dementia involves neurofibrillary tangles. Thank you so much for the super heart. I appreciate it. HS. Really appreciate it. So, basic dementia just arises from sort of like a broad global breakdown in the ability of different brain regions to communicate with one another effectively. And so, while having lesions in your brain induced by aluminum salts might result in, behaviors that resemble dementia, like even the dementia associated with Alzheimer's disease, caused by Alzheimer's disease, it doesn't mean that it's the same thing, and it certainly doesn't mean that that's what's happening in Alzheimer's disease. And so, the point being that really there's no evidence, first of all, that people who happen to be exposed to greater levels of aluminum in their environment develop Alzheimer's disease at a greater frequency. There's not enough evidence of that to surpass a threshold of like scientific consensus. But there's also no evidence to suggest that there's any similarity between any like meaningful similarity between the brain, the anatomy of the brain of an organism or an animal who's had aluminum salts exposure in their brain and that of Alzheimer's disease patients. Now, that being said, avoiding exposure to like industrial compounds, generally speaking, is probably a prudent way to move about the world. But yeah, is getting enough protein very important to fighting dementia? Well, I mean, getting enough protein is important to, baseline health. So the tragedy, dementia and Alzheimer's disease in particular, I think is one of the most devastating diseases that one can develop, just because, of course, because there's no cure, and there's the way that it affects people is not by overtly changing their appearance, not by really causing any change in, if you were to just look at a person, that would be recognizable. Rather, it attacks the substrate of consciousness, and it changes a person's personality. It changes their ability to remember their past with you. And so therefore the interactions that people can have with Alzheimer's disease, with people who don't, with their family members, obviously, can be devastating and are devastating. So anyways, that aside, a competent diet is important for, baseline health, I haven't seen any evidence that, for example, like making sure that you get enough lysine or valine or, isoleucine. I've never seen any evidence that those things are particularly like beneficial in the progression of Alzheimer's disease, like that it slows it down. But, just because somebody has Alzheimer's disease doesn't mean that they can't develop some other malady. And so, just having a competent diet is prudent. Now, it's funny that you bring that up, because the one thing I forgot to mention on our last conversation about Alzheimer's is there is this interesting line of evidence that a certain ingredient, I've actually talked about it, I think, every week for the past while, that's used most closely associated with like Indian, like South Asian, Indian cuisine, called turmeric. There's evidence to suggest that exposure to turmeric, and specifically curcumin in turmeric, tends to be associated with a less aggressive or a lower propensity for dementia. And it's actually, there's enough evidence to have motivated a clinical trial to evaluate if increasing turmeric in a person's diet might mitigate their risk for Alzheimer's disease or dementia. Unfortunately, the other dietary component that has been that was previously thought to be beneficial for dementia, that has been proven to not be particularly beneficial or not really have any effect, is omega-3 fatty acids. For the longest time, you would not be surprised to find a physician or a biomedical scientist saying, if any supplement, any vitamin, any thing that you can get at Vitamin Shop is good for you, it's probably omega-3 fatty acids. And there was good evidence for that. Like that wasn't just like a baseless assumption. However, fairly recently, in the past few years, extremely large clinical trials or assessments of the benefits of omega-3 fatty acids have been conducted. And since those studies, it's become fairly clear that omega-3 fatty acids, they're not bad for you necessarily. You're not consuming enough omega-3 fatty acids to just be like consuming too much fat, but they don't seem to produce any, substantive health, like measurable benefits in terms of health. Okay, guys, I should probably call it a day. Get this baby some dinner. Thanks for hanging out. Happy Easter if you celebrate Easter. I have a YouTube channel. It's called youtube.com/anthropoid. Today I talked about some new efforts in developing new treatments for COVID-19. A study that monitored just how far SARS-CoV-2, that causes COVID-19, can spread in a medical facility. Short tip, don't touch computer mice or doorknobs. And I also talked about just how confident we ought to be in hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. Talked about the evidence for that. So you can find that by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/anthropoid. Just search Anthropoid Brain, Anthropoid Ian, something like that. And toss me a subscription if you're interested. I before every time I'm live on here, I do about 15 to 20 minutes there on specific topics like I discussed right just then. I have a podcast called Wired to be Weird. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about pheromones, we talked about déjà vu, we talked about dementia, we talked about politics, we talked about whether addiction is a disease or a disorder. We talked about a lot of stuff. There's hours and hours of conversations between me and my co-host. And it's called Wired to be Weird. You can find it where all fine podcasts are podcasted. Can't talk. I don't do that on the podcast. I'm a much better speaker on the podcast. So Wired to be Weird. And I have a Patreon. And I know these times are very economically challenging, but if you're in a position to support my work, I would deeply appreciate it. Patreon.com/anthropoid. And so I would appreciate it, but I understand people are in difficult situations right now. Unprecedented. So with that, hopefully I'll see you at some point this upcoming week, but if I don't, I'll see you at the same time, same place, same general vicinity next Sunday. Happy Easter, everybody. See you guys. All right, YouTubers. Thanks for watching, folks. I really enjoy doing this, and I appreciate that you're checking it out over here. And I'd like to keep doing it. So thanks for your support. Have a great rest of your Sunday. Happy Easter. See you guys.